the final part of respiration which we're going to consider is the electron transport chain. Before we look at the electron transport chain, we'll just consider what we've accrued to this point. If we think of glycolysis, we made 2 ATP and 2 NADH. In the link reaction, we made 2 NADH. In the Krebs cycle, we made 6 NADH, 2 FADH, and 2 ATP molecules. Now, obviously we know the importance of ATP. What we need to consider now is we need to consider exactly why we need these NADH molecules, and the answer is in the electron transport chain. So after the processes we've just mentioned floating around in the cytoplasm, we have these NADH and FADH molecules. Well, the electron transport chain is composed of, as you can see, 4 main carriers. We've got carrier 1, carrier 2, carrier 3, and carrier 4. And then we've got something else over here which we'll think about later. The first thing that happens is, in the matrix, NADH becomes oxidized to NAD. There's an oxidation, oxidation is lost, electrons are lost, and the electrons flow into the first carrier. They then pass to the second, to the third, to the fourth, before leaving and combining with oxygen and making water eventually. But this isn't the whole story. What actually happens at each of these stages is a hydrogen ion will be drawn into the intermembrane space at carriers 1, 3, and 4, which means we've got 3 H+ floating around in the intermembrane space that weren't there before. These 3 hydrogen ions move back through this molecule, this carrier. When they do that, they cause the production of ATP from ADP plus PI, which makes this an ATPase. So we have our ATPase here producing ATP. Obviously we've got 3 hydrogen ions, which means that we must have 3 ADP and 3 ATP. So for each NADH, that makes 3 ATP molecules. This means with the 10 NADH that we actually have, that gives us 30 ATP being produced. Remember, we had 2 from the link reaction, 2 from glycolysis, and 6 from the Krebs cycle. But that doesn't deal with the 2 FADH molecules. Now these 2 FADH molecules become oxidized at carrier 2. So we have our FADH, that becomes oxidized to FAD, and the electrons move on to that carrier. So they move to 2. They then move on to 3, on to 4, and then D- binds with the oxygen to make water along with the hydrogen ions. If we remember from our previous diagram, only 1, 3, and 4 move hydrogen ions. So here and here we get a hydrogen ion moving in, which means we have 2 hydrogen ions. They will move back through our ATPase to produce 2 ATP, which means that obviously if we've got 1 FADH making 2 ATP, our 2 FADH will make 4 ATP. So if we were to summarise the whole process, if we've got glycolysis, that produces 2 ATP. And if we look at the Krebs cycle, that produces 2 ATP. If we look at the electron transport chain, that produces 34 ATP, a phenomenal amount. Now, each time we looked at the ETC, oxygen was the final electron acceptor. With no oxygen, the electrons have nowhere to go. This can't happen. If this doesn't happen, if the ETC doesn't happen, NAD is not regenerated. If that's not regenerated, that can't happen. So without oxygen, the only thing that happens is that. That is anaerobic respiration. So if we consider the whole, the electron transport chain produces the ATP. Glycolysis and the Krebs cycle break down the glucose to produce NADH and FADH.